All right, let's go ahead and get started because it is 5 after, and I have a habit of finishing kind of late. So,
is the audio synced up?
Yeah, I believe it is. Can you press the red button on the back there? Oh, did you already do that?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, you're backlit. I'll edit this part out. All right, so this is the last week on Luther. I got one more week because I hadn't actually talked about Luther's Theology of the Cross. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about Martin Luther's Theology of the Cross. This is his programmatic statement that undergirds his whole theology, and really powerful, but we'll get to it in just a little bit. The first thing I want to do is I just want to review what we said last time. Last time we talked about Luther's mature theology, and we talked in particular about his view of justification. And if you remember, if you don't remember, I'll summarize it a little bit. For Luther, justification was undergirded by the totus homo anthropology. The totus homo anthropology was that idea that Paul's distinction between flesh and spirit that he makes at various places in his epistles doesn't refer, as Augustine and other Platonists thought, to two competing natures in man, the flesh or the body, which is associated with the body, and then the soul or spirit, which tended toward God. But rather the flesh and the spirit were two ways of thinking about the whole man, body, soul, and spirit. So you could either characterize body, soul, and spirit as flesh, or you could characterize body, soul, and spirit as spirit. So from this totus homo anthropology, Luther came to the conclusion, or was able to come to the conclusion, that the believer is simul justus et peccator. So the believer is simultaneously just and sinful. The Christian is righteous before the face of God, while being unrighteous before the face of man. The unbeliever, conversely, is unrighteous before the face of God, but righteous, or we might say righteous, before the face of man, or in the presence of man. So Luther said that you could be both at the same time a sinner and a righteous person. And from this, Luther was forced to develop a new idea, a new conception of the nature of righteousness. And his new conception of righteousness was the Justitia Christi Aliena, the alien righteousness of Christ. So this is a profound idea, and it's probably Luther's most original idea. Nobody had ever thought of this before in the history of Christian theology. The alien righteousness of Christ is the idea that the righteousness by which we are justified is not our own inherent righteousness that we have in ourselves, but it's a righteousness that is outside of us, that comes to us on account of Christ. And in fact, it is Christ's righteousness. This righteousness is acquired, along with Christ acquiring our sin, in what Luther calls the Great Exchange.
How was it thought of before then? He was the first one to come up with that.
Yeah, for Augustine and everybody after Augustine up until Luther, righteousness, when God justified you, justification didn't mean to declare righteous. Justification meant to make righteous. So in other words, the justification was the process of you becoming more righteous, rather than God forensically declaring you to be righteous. Now, Luther isn't quite there. Luther didn't write the Westminster Confession, but this is a huge step away from what everybody else had believed before him, this idea of the alien righteousness of Christ. So for Augustine and for others, it was an internal righteousness. The Christian life and justification was all about an internal righteousness, whereas for Luther, it was about an external righteousness. And a righteousness that's not our own, but that belongs to Christ and comes from Christ.
But did Augustine believe that we had it in ourselves already, or that God put it into us?
No, God put it into us. It was a gift of grace. The issue wasn't... Luther and Augustine were on the same page regarding the agent of justification and justification by grace alone. But as to the meaning of the nature of justification, it was different. What is justification? Luther and Augustine had different answers. So, I want to talk a little bit before we talk about the theology of the cross. I want to talk a little bit more about Luther's concept of righteousness. Now, this is important because Luther's concept of righteousness, Luther's idea of righteousness, was part of the development of his theology of the cross. For Luther, unlike for the medieval scholastics, in particular somebody like Thomas Aquinas, there is a radical dichotomy between human and divine concepts of righteousness. So much so that when we say Colby is righteous and we say God is righteous, we're almost saying two completely different things. So for Luther, there's a large and a qualitative difference between divine righteousness and human righteousness. This is why our own righteousness won't do. This is why we need the righteousness of another that comes from outside of us. For Luther, the righteousness that we were justified by was recognizable as such before the face of God, or the Latin phrase is coram Deo, but not before men, coram hominibus. And in fact, paradoxically, and Luther loves his paradoxes, when one was declared righteous, when one was justified, the result wasn't that you became more righteous, at least in the way that you perceived yourself. The result was that you perceived yourself as more and more sinful. So as you become more and more righteous, you perceive yourself as more and more sinful. And in fact, that's how you get justified, is you confess your sinfulness before God. So here's what he says. He says this in his lectures on Romans. Scripture uses the terms righteousness and unrighteousness very differently from the philosophers and lawyers. This is obvious because they consider these things as a quality of the soul. But the righteousness of Scripture depends upon the imputation of God more than on the essence of a thing itself. For he does not have righteousness who only has a quality. Indeed, he is altogether a sinner and an unrighteous man. But he alone has righteousness, whom God mercifully regards as righteous, because of his confession of his own unrighteousness, and because of his prayer for the righteousness of God, and whom God wills to be considered righteous before him. Therefore, we are all born in iniquity, that is, in unrighteousness, and we die in it. And we are righteous only by the imputation of a merciful God through faith in His Word. So, it's important to understand that when Luther thinks about righteousness, it's a righteousness that isn't recognizable by ordinary human standards. It's a righteousness from God and defined by God. And are there any questions about that? These insights about justification and the nature of justifying righteousness are important because they lead to the theology of the cross. That's what I want to talk about for the rest of the time. The theology of the cross. What is it? Well, it's kind of hard to answer. The theology of the cross is a powerful theological program that undergirded Luther's whole theology. So you can see it everywhere. That's why I started with righteousness. And you could say that the theology of the cross is a lot of different things. It's a theological method. It's a perspective on Christology and soteriology. It's a theology of suffering and the Christian life. But more than anything, the theology of the cross is a Christ-centered theology of paradox that utterly confounds human expectations and utterly destroys human reason and righteousness. And it's also, talking about historical theology here, an appeal to rediscover the teachings of Augustine, especially in his anti-Pelagian writings, which apparently had faded even in his own Augustinian order. So let me say a quick word about the development of the theology of the cross. The theology of the cross was really developed over the whole period between 1514 and 1519. 1514 was when Luther was giving his early lectures on the Psalms, and then 1519 is sort of the end of phase one, or just around the time of the end of phase one of Luther's theological development. And the theology of the cross was given its most definitive statement in the Heidelberg Disputation. Luther wrote the Heidelberg Disputation in April 1518, and the occasion was that he was asked to give a presentation of his theology before his Augustinian order in Heidelberg, Germany. So remember, 1518 is when he gave this. The year before is when everything, broke out. This was the year after he posted his 95 Theses. And so at the time that Luther gave his Heidelberg Disputation, there was quite a bit of controversy surrounding him. And I think the Heidelberg Disputation is worth reading for a couple of important reasons. If you want to read one thing by Luther, I would recommend Bondage of the Will. If you only read two things, I would read the Bondage of the Will and the Heidelberg Disputation. The Heidelberg Disputation is one of the single most helpful summaries of Luther's whole theology. And it's uniquely and notably, the Heidelberg Disputation is thoughtfully and carefully constructed. If you go back and you look at his 95 Theses, they're just kind of scattershot, like they're kind of all over the place. Not that that's a defect, really. It's just a difference of occasion. Or if you look at his disputation against scholastic theology, it was just sentence, 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 sentence. Like, I can imagine him sitting down and listing everything he ever thought that was wrong about the Via Moderna. But the Heidelberg Disputation is actually very thoughtful and very carefully constructed. And there's a structure to it. It starts out, famously, it starts out with the law of God, and then there's a bridge all the way to the love of God, and we get there by the grace of God. And sort of right in the middle, he talks about the theology of the cross, even though it undergirds the whole thing. So in this, he talks about his whole theology. He talks about sin, he talks about grace, he talks about free will, the law, and the love of God. And the statements get at the core, the statements that he makes, particularly Theses 19 through 22, get at the core of the theology of the cross, and they can be seen as not only the core of the theology of the cross, but also the heart of Luther's whole theology. So, in order to unpack these theses and the theology of the cross, let me start by looking at some of the earlier theses in the Heidelberg Disputation, because the whole document, everything he says in the document, is really undergirded by the theology of the cross. So we're going to start with Theses 3 and 4, and then we're going to look at these later theses on the theology of the cross. But these Theses 3 and 4, let me read them to you, and then I'll give you my first point about the theology of the cross. And the other thing, by the way, about the Heidelberg Disputation is all of the theses that he wrote, he took time to write a few paragraphs explaining the thesis for each one, which he doesn't do that with his other disputations. So, Theses 3 and 4. Number 3, although the works of man always seem attractive and good, they are nevertheless likely to be mortal sins. Number 4, although the works of God always seem unattractive and appear evil, they are nevertheless really eternal merits. So here's what he's doing here. And here's the first point about the theology of the cross. The theology of the cross exposes the sinfulness of apparently good human works and righteousness. In the first part of the Heidelberg Disputation, Luther spends the whole time stripping humans of all of their soteriological resources. He says that they're condemned under sin. They're condemned by the law. They don't have free will. They're basically in a position where they have to despair. And here, he's getting at, in these two theses, he's getting at the point that human works, whether done by the righteous or the unrighteous, are always tainted with sin. Human works appear attractive outwardly, that is, especially human works by the unrighteous, but within they are filthy. And this is Luther here, as Christ says concerning the Pharisees in Matthew 23. For they appear to the doer and others good and beautiful, yet God does not judge according to appearances, but searches the minds and hearts. For without grace and faith, it is impossible to have a pure heart. And that's from his explanation of Thesis 3. And then, not only are all human works tainted with sin, but even the works of the righteous are tainted with sin. So Luther quotes that verse from Ecclesiastes about the man who does good and sins. Or there is no man who does good and never sins. And so all of this means that what lies within us, as he says in Thesis 16, is sinful. And so the person who believes that he can obtain grace by doing what is in him adds sin to sin so that he becomes doubly guilty. So that's human works. They appear righteous to those outside, to ordinary human faculties and reason. But by contrast, Luther says, The works of God appear ugly and unattractive. Now, by works of God here, Luther means, I think, both the way that God works in the world and the way that God works in believers. And of course, these appearances are relative to the faculties of normal, fallen, worldly, human reason. The works of God appear evil. The works of men appear good. So for Luther, the only way to do good works is by recognizing that there is evil in them, in the works, and in us, and by humbling oneself and relying on God's grace. In this way, he says, consequently, the unattractive works which God does in us, that is, those which are humble and devout, are really eternal. For humility and fear of God are our entire merit. So this is the beginnings of the theology of the cross. Works that seem good to the world and to natural reason are evil in the sight of God. And the way God works in the world seems foolish to the world and evil. And this comes back to Luther's idea of righteousness. In order to receive the alien righteousness of Christ, what does a person have to do? A person has to recognize his own unrighteousness. A person has to recognize that he falls short, that he is unworthy, that he is unrighteous, in order for God to give him the alien righteousness of Christ. And this is what God does to us through His revelation. This is what Luther says in his lectures on Romans. He says, the chief purpose of this letter is to break down, to pluck up, and to destroy all wisdom and righteousness of the flesh. This includes all the works which in the eyes of people, or even in our own eyes, may be great works. No matter whether these works are done with a sincere heart and mind, this letter is to affirm and state and magnify sin, no matter how much someone insists that it does not exist or that it was believed not to exist. So that's how we start in the Heidelberg Disputation. The theology of the cross destroys all human ideas of righteousness, all human ideas of good works, and reverses everything we thought we knew about morality. Works that seem good to the world and to natural reason are evil in the sight of God, and the way God works in the world seems foolish and evil to the world. And the theology of the cross is the theological perspective that undergirds Luther's thinking about these issues. Salvation, free will, good works, they all start with the theology of the cross. They all start with human reason and righteousness and good works utterly destroyed and laid bare at the foot of the cross. So that's number one. Number two, the theology of the cross, besides destroying good works, is also a theology of revelation. The theology of the cross shows us that the only proper way to see God is through Christ crucified. And here's where we come to the famous theses 19 through 22, where he talks about the theology of the cross. Let me just read them. It's just four sentences. That person does not deserve to be called a theologian who looks upon the invisible things of God as though they were clearly perceptible in those things which have actually happened, referencing Romans 1:20. Number 20. He deserves to be called a theologian, however, who comprehends the visible and manifest things of God seen through suffering and the cross. 21. A theologian of glory calls evil good and good evil. A theologian of the cross calls a thing what it actually is. 22. That wisdom which sees the invisible things of God in works as perceived by man is completely puffed up, blinded, and hardened. So, we're getting here to the very core of the theology of the cross. These theses, these four theses, along with their explanations, which again are helpful, reveal a very particular view of revelation that's undergirded by Paul's discussion of the wisdom and the power of God in 1 Corinthians 1. I'm not going to go there, but this is basically where Luther gets the idea of the theology of the cross, 1 Corinthians 1. So, here's what the theology of the cross has to say about revelation. First of all, the theology of the cross is against a theology of speculation. For Luther, we have to look for God according to the way that He has revealed Himself, and not according to our own wisdom and judgment. And the decisive revelation of Himself that God has provided is Christ crucified, and Him alone. That's important. This is how the theologian of the cross sees revelation. The theologian of the cross doesn't speculate, doesn't try to understand the nature of God in an abstract way. The theologian of the cross is content to look at the cross and to submit to it. The theologian of glory is just the opposite. The theologian of glory is the one who tries to see beyond the cross. He tries to see behind the cross. He tries to get behind it, to speculate about the nature of God from the created order by human reason, without reference to Christ. The theologian of glory, or theologians of glory, operate on the assumption that creation and history are transparent to the human intellect, that one can see through what is made and what happens so as to peer into the invisible things of God. And here we come to the core of the theology of the cross. The theology of the cross points to the decisive revelation of God at the cross in the person of Jesus. But here's the catch. The theology of the cross says this revelation that God has made of Himself on the cross is a concealed revelation. It's a hidden revelation. Now, what does that mean? How can you have a concealed revelation? That's an oxymoron. Well, what Luther uses to illustrate this point is this. Remember the story in Exodus 33 of Moses asking to see God's glory. Moses wants a a view of God's glory. And so he says, God, show me your glory. A bold question. And God says, okay, look, I can't show you my face because, I don't know, you'd die, you wouldn't be able to bear it. But here's what I'll do. I'm going to pick you up and put you on this rock, and then I'm going to pass by you. And as I'm passing by you, I'm going to cover you with my hand. And then once I pass by you, I'll remove my hand, and you'll be able to see my backside. For Luther, God never reveals his face to the world. He doesn't reveal himself in his naked glory, just as he didn't reveal it to Moses. Rather, God only reveals his back to the world. What Luther calls the posteriora Dei. And what does the back of God look like? The back of God looks like Christ crucified. It looks like suffering. That's God's back, his posterior. God reveals himself in the cross of Christ. But it's not, that revelation that he makes of himself is not immediately recognizable as God. And this is why it's a concealed revelation. The cross doesn't look like what we would expect God to look like. It's hidden, it's concealed, and yet at the same time, it's revealed. Here's what one theologian said. Of all the places to search for God, the last place most people would think to look is the gallows. Martin Luther confessed that there, in the shadows cast by death, God does indeed meet his straying, rebellious human creatures. There, God reveals who he is. There, he reveals who they are. Not in flight beyond the clouds, but in the dust of the grave, God has come to tell it like it is about himself and about humanity. I think that's a wonderful paragraph. For Luther, that's the theology of the cross at its core. God has revealed himself to humanity, but it's a hidden revelation. It's a concealed revelation because it doesn't look like what we would have thought he would have looked like. Are there any questions about that? All right. So, that leads to the next point about the theology of the cross. Because God has revealed himself in a concealed revelation, the theology of the cross is and must be a theology of faith. The key to unlocking the concealed revelation of God is faith. The unbeliever looks at the cross and sees folly. But the believer, with the eyes of faith, looks at the cross and looks at Jesus hanging there and sees God revealed in suffering. So two people can look at the same event and come away with two completely different interpretations of it. And one makes sense according to ordinary, normal, fallen human reason, and the other only makes sense according to the eyes of faith, which is a gift from God. So, the last point, any questions about that? The last point about the theology of the cross is that for Luther, and I told you that the theology of the cross is many things, and it also is a perspective that undergirds his whole theological program. For Luther, the theology of the cross isn't just about human righteousness, and it isn't even just about how God reveals himself in the cross, although that's sort of the core of it. In the theology of the cross, God is known through suffering, not just in the crucifixion of Christ, but also in the suffering of the Christian. So here is where the theology of the cross becomes a powerful statement for the Christian life. For Luther, who's a strong predestinarian, God makes himself known through suffering in the life of the believer. And God, in Luther's view, is very active in this suffering. He isn't just known through the suffering, he makes himself known through the suffering. And here, we have to make a distinction, which Luther makes, between the opus proprium Dei and the opus alienum Dei. And that means the proper work of God and the alien work of God. Luther illustrates this with reference to conversion. So think about the conversion experience for an individual. For Luther, excuse me, in order for a person to receive God's grace, he must be humbled and brought low by the law and be made to recognize his sin and despair of all ability and hope. So, Luther said, but if he does that, if he does despair, when he is brought low by the work of God, the result is that he's justified. So a person has to undergo a terrible experience of suffering and despair in order to be brought back up again. So, Luther says, an action which is alien to God's nature results in a deed belonging to his very nature. He makes a person a sinner so that he may make him righteous. So this is the key for Luther to understanding suffering in his life. Luther says that God causes suffering in the life of the believer. And when he does this, it is his alien work. That is, it's a work that he does that isn't proper to his nature. It's kind of unfortunate, but he has to do it. In this case, in the case of the believer, the alien work is causing humility and despair before the law. But he does this in order to justify the person. And when he justifies the person, that is God's proper work in that person. So the alien work is an end to the proper work. God does what he hates, God does what is alien to him in order that he may do what is proper to him. God does a bad thing in your life in order that he may do a good thing in your life. And what this meant for Luther is that the Christian is called to embrace suffering. Not just endure it, not just get through it, but embrace it and even love it. The theologian of the cross, when he encounters suffering in his life, will recognize the suffering as an alien work of God. Here's what Alistair McGrath says, "Far from regarding suffering or evil as a nonsensical intrusion into the world, which Luther regards as the opinion of a theologian of glory, the theologian of the cross regards such suffering as his most precious treasure, for revealed and yet hidden in precisely such sufferings is none other than the living God, working out the salvation of those whom He loves." So that is how Luther faced his sufferings. And remember, this wasn't academic for Luther, because Luther had a lot of sufferings in his life, both psychological, theological, physical. Life, Luther did not lead an easy life. And he suffered all the time from something called Anfechtung, which is kind of, he regarded as, you could translate it like temptation or even assault. But when Luther had these bouts of intense attacks, even if he thought they were caused by the devil, he always ultimately attributed them to God. Not in a work that was proper to his nature, but in a work that was alien from his nature. But the alien work of God was all for his good, because the alien work of God was to get him to the proper work of God. The alien work of God was to, sanctify him and ultimately get him and keep him on the road to salvation. So for Luther, this was a very personal and a very powerful statement of suffering in the Christian life. So that is a basic summary of the theology of the cross. I do have some concluding comments, including a poem. But does anybody have any questions about the theology of the cross?
Sounds like what you were just saying, that the end justifies the means, which is not what we normally like to say.
Well, I mean, not for Machiavelli, not for Fidel Castro or other human dictators. But this is what Luther would say, this is why Luther would say that God is a hidden God. That God works in mysterious ways. I hate to use that phrase, but that's essentially the idea. That, God brings about all of these things in your life so that He can justify you, so that He can sanctify you. It's sort of like Romans 8. God works all things for your good. But He does it, and you should expect Him to do it through suffering. And when the suffering comes, you should embrace it. Not really a fun theology, not a theology of fun. Any other questions on the theology of the cross?
So based on that, it sounds like you said, Luther, you should expect to suffer as a true Christian.
Oh, yeah.
Now, so what if you, from your opinion, don't feel like you're suffering?
If you don't feel like you're suffering.
Or, when you describe Luther's suffering and what he went through,
Right.
you really look back and say, I've got similar experiences to that.
Yeah. I think it's a really hard question to answer.
Luther was one of those all in on everything, all the way people.
Yeah. I don't think that Luther would say,
I'd say it's
qualitative.
In other words, you don't have to suffer the same way Luther suffered or perceived his suffering.
Yeah, I don't think Luther would say you're not really a Christian if you're not, I think it's possible that a lot of Luther's sufferings, the Anfechtung, was, just due to his particular temperament, although I think that there were a lot of other factors as well, like the late medieval theology. But I wouldn't want to say that it's totally that. And certainly Scripture is clear that, Just, 2 Timothy says that if you want to, or Paul in 2 Timothy says that you should expect suffering in the Christian life. So I don't think that's just a question for Luther. Yeah.
Well, it's not the scale of suffering, it's the scale of Christian identity or Christian attainment.
Right.
It's not a continuum like, you're not looking at Christian, you know, you suffer.
Right, yeah. You don't want to turn suffering into a work like, oh man, look at how much I'm suffering. Which is probably,
Self-imposed.
or self-imposed, right.
Can't be self-imposed.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you're flaying yourself, I guess that doesn't really count.
I'll stop that immediately.
All right, good. Any other questions? We have maybe time for one more question.
I throw in quickly, right, this is a hugely complex question, and it deserves a lot more attention. But Luther would even regard prosperity as a form of Christian suffering, because it severs our connection of dependence. So, and once again, it's not where we would expect to find suffering, because it's what we want the most.
Mm-hmm.
And yet Luther would say that's where we perhaps are in the most danger. And that may be something a little more common to our experience in our part of the world at this stage in the world's history
Yeah.
for the Christian church. And it allows us to indulge our tendencies to be theologians of glory.
Right.
Bigger, better, stronger, powerful.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's good.
Thank you.
I mean, just to say I don't have anything to add to that. All right, well, let's go ahead and conclude here. I just have a couple of thoughts. Could probably do a whole another series on this, but not a huge deal. So we've looked at Luther 6 weeks. We started from Augustine all the way back in 500 or so. And I hope that you've been able to see, if you remember what we talked about all that time ago, how the theology really developed. And one of my overall theses for this Sunday school was that the Reformation was about a recovery of Augustinian theology. And even in the preface, Luther quotes Augustine all the time, but just one example, even in the preface to the Heidelberg Disputation, Luther says, hey, I'm interpreting this theology is according to Augustine. So this is, I've attempted to give you a overview of what I think are some of the most important points to see this big picture idea in church history, that the Pelagian controversy that Augustine was involved in did not end after Augustine, didn't end after the Council of Orange, which was lost, and was continued in the Reformation. And so I would basically see the Reformation, and I think that Luther would certainly say this, the Reformation was a continuation of the Pelagian controversy and a recovery of Augustine's doctrines of grace and his doctrine of sin, with some important modifications in the area of justification. So, I have 4 lessons from the study, and we don't have time, so I'll just mention them briefly. Number 1, God must get the glory in salvation. Whatever theological system you have, the ultimate rule is that God gets the glory. And for Luther, if you look at his bondage of the will, for example, this was the problem that he had with Erasmus. If we don't know who does what in salvation, we don't know how much to praise God. And it's all about, in the end, making sure that God gets the glory. Soli Deo Gloria. Number 2, the importance of anthropology in your doctrine of sin for your doctrine of salvation. And this is something I've mentioned a couple of times. if you have a weak anthropology, or a wrong anthropology, or a weak doctrine of sin, if you say that, we weren't completely fallen, or the effects of Adam's fall they were just, it was unfortunate, but, we were kind of wounded, but we're still kind of okay, then your theology of grace isn't going to be as strong as it could be. And then God doesn't get the glory. So, it goes back to number 1. Number 3, a theology, I think this is important, a theology is only as good as its doctrine of assurance. This was the problem in late medieval theology. Yeah, they tried to protect it from Pelagianism by saying, we have this system where there are congruent merits and condign merits, and you initiate your salvation, but it's only congruent merits, remember? And it's grace because God set up the system. Well, under that system, there was no assurance for the believer. And so I think that theology is ultimately going to fail. There's no assurance. A theology is only as good as its doctrine of assurance. Number 4, Christ has to be central in our theology. Go to the cross. You could talk about the whole theology of the Via Moderna and late medieval theology without mentioning Christ. And that's not right. That should raise huge red flags if you talk about theology without talking about Christ and the cross as central. Okay, so just some things to think about, and now I'll end with this poem. This is by W.H. Auden, and it's called Luther. With conscience cocked to listen for the thunder, he saw the devil busy in the wind, over the chiming steeples and then under the doors of nuns and doctors who sinned. What apparatus could stave off disaster or cut the brambles of man's error down? Flesh was a silent dog that bites its master, world a still pond in which its children drown. The fuse of judgment spluttered in his head. Lord, smoke these honeyed insects from their hives. All works, great men's societies are bad. The just shall live by faith, he cried in dread. And men and women of the world were glad, who'd never cared or trembled in their lives. So, that was a beautiful poem about Luther. So we're dismissed. Let's get ready for worship.